Good morning and good evening to our online participants from North America, from Asia, and from other parts of the world. Welcome you all to today's webinar on Middle Power Countries, Perspective on the U.S.-China Relations. My name is Nong Hong. I am the Executive Director of the Institute for China-America Studies. ICAS is an independent think tank based in Washington, D.C. We are focused on research on many of the key issues affecting or concerning the U.S.-China relations that need greater and mutual understanding. Today's event is co-hosted with China Institute, University of Alberta of Canada, and Grandview Institute of China. China Institute is a long-time corporate partner with ICAS. It is Canada's only established multidisciplinary think tank and research center focused on China studies. Grandview Institute is one of the leading independent think tank in China, focused research on ocean strategy and security, Belt and Road Initiative opportunities and risks, defense, security, development, digital government, among others. Let me just say a few words on the background of today's event. There is ongoing enormous academic writings, policy discussion, debates, and dialogues on the U.S.-China relations. So why is it important to understand China and America's global vision from their respective perspective? It's also very important to address these bilateral relations from the perspective of other global actors and stakeholders. So many of these countries find themselves in a very similar situation as middle power countries, and they are important partners for both China and the United States to engage in many of the global challenges. So today's event brings together experts who are going to talk from the perspective of 5 middle power countries, Canada, Australia, India, Japan, and South Korea. They're going to present to discuss these countries' perspective on these very critical and very competitive U.S.-China relations. This panel will be moderated by Ms. Wang Jia. Jia is the current interim director of China Institute, University of Alberta. She has been managing research programs in government and media relations since 2011. She has over 15 years of direct management experience and research background focused on economic and political dimension of contemporary China and also Canada-China relations in various capacities. Jia is also a vice board member of the Canada-China Forum. So I'm going to give the floor to Jia for moderation.
Thank you very much, Nong. The China Institute and I are so delighted to once again to collaborate with you and ICAS team to support this event. It is really my privilege to welcome our panel of distinguished international speakers. I will just briefly introduce everyone, and their full bios are available on the event page. Our first panelist is Mr. Ron McIntosh. Ron is a friend and a senior fellow at the China Institute at the University of Alberta. He is joining us from Ottawa today. Mr. McIntosh served in Canadian Foreign Service for 35 years with a primary focus on the Asia-Pacific, especially in the trade and economic issues. He held multiple senior roles in the ministry, including Director General, Strategic Planning, Resources, and Coordination. Our next speaker is Professor Deepa Olapalli. Professor Olapalli is a research professor of international affairs and the director of the Rising Powers Initiative at the Singer Center for Asian Studies, Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. She's a specialist on India foreign policy, Asian region and maritime security, and also comparative foreign policy outlooks of rising powers. Our next speaker joining us from Japan is Professor Rumi Oyama. She is the director of Waseda Institute of Contemporary Chinese Studies and the professor at the Graduate School of Asian Pacific Studies at Waseda University. She specializes in China's contemporary foreign policy and politics. Also joining us from Asia, in this case, South Korea, is Captain Yoon Suk-jun. He is currently a senior fellow at the Korean Institute for Military Affairs. His previous career spanned over 35 years in the Republic of Korea's armed forces and served as a Navy captain and also in a variety of senior policy roles. And our fifth speaker joining us today from Washington, D.C. is Saurabh Gupta. He is the senior fellow at the Institute for China-America Studies. Mr. Gupta is a senior Asia-Pacific international relations specialist with 2 decades of experience in political risk research and policy advising and analysis in Washington, D.C. Welcome all our panelists. We are so looking forward to your opening remarks and also our discussion afterwards. We would invite our participants today to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. You're welcome to submit your questions throughout the presentation and also the discussion, but we'll reserve the time after the opening remarks to address the questions. So without further ado, I would like to turn the virtual floor first over to Ron for your opening thoughts. Ron, the floor is yours.
Thank you. You can hear me? You all can hear me. Okay, good. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this gathering, albeit virtual. It's an important topic for us, this U.S. China encounter. We're all affected. Canada is affected. Other middle powers are affected. It distorts, it has a potential and the reality of distorting the economics of our countries, and it certainly has the potential and the reality of sideswiping us on a number of trade areas. It can be exaggerated. We don't know the full effect of it, partly because the U.S.-China trade deal was never fully implemented, and as far as last I heard, it didn't even get to phase 2 yet. So that is it's hard to come up with an empirical impact. In security, this is not a clash of civilizations, but the risks do abound and are exaggerated by a distancing of values that have taken place and by something that we all share as middle powers as a concern, and that's the accelerating drift away from rules-based frameworks. A little bit of history, past to present. The dispute between US and China is something of an erosion or even a collapse of the optimism of the late 1970s. The optimism arising from the openings, which were ironically led by the US and China. Hope was given that differing systems could be bridged, and that's lately diminished. And not only that, there seems to be a loss of political will and ability to re-engineer habits and practices. Agendas seem less readily shareable. There's a descent in the discourse towards zero-sum or decoupling fascinations. Basically, 1978 seems like a very long time ago. So how can middle powers help? If you study political science in Canada, as I did many, many years ago, we were all told that Canada was a middle power and that we contributed a lot to what was going on in the post-war world. But punched above our weight was often the term used. We're not so sure about that anymore. And in the present context, it's not even, and this is somewhat contrary to the advertisement to this event, it's not even self-evident that middle powers are seen as important partners, quote unquote. Yet Canada and other middle powers, we can't sit back. We need proactive strategy and we need like-minded company. Individual U.S.-China issues are the stakes, as high as the stakes are, individual Chinese U.S. issues are a bit arcane, they're complex, they're domestically politicized, as we all know, and they don't lend themselves to very easy solution. At risk is free trade and the free trade system, open competition, the progress of the knowledge economy and knowledge exchange. At risk is the potential for progress that we might otherwise make on issues like climate change and infectious diseases, and perhaps even finding ways forward together on issues of human rights and global development. Or, shall we add, avoiding arms races. That's out of my field of expertise, but it is a concern. In a different way, the U.S.-China impasse and how well or how badly it's managed is as much an existential threat to the system as the present crisis in Ukraine. Yet the world's not coming to an end for middle powers. That's too gloomy. Canada is doing okay, for instance, in its trade with China and with the US, and that's despite the pandemic and despite the discriminatory aspects of the phase one trade deal, and notwithstanding political tensions, bilateral and international, that afflict the encounter between Canada and China, and sometimes with the United States. The near-term outlook is uncertain at best. With the US, Canada is generally fortunate to have such a good neighbor. Well, most of the time, on most issues, not all the time. For the US policymakers, Canada can be an afterthought, but the thoughts are at least positive. And the US does listen, and on occasion sees Canada as a valued ally worth engaging. Indeed, this is part of the thesis here, middle powers can be part of solutions, a force to offset the negative consequences of the US-China friction. But messages conveyed by middle powers must be compelling, even sharp sometimes. This is before value can be added and behavior altered. The US, as suggested, does find us selectively useful, and the idea of allies and partnership is welcome again in the US, or so it seems. But China, seemingly perhaps a little less so. It's not that China doesn't know or care how it is perceived or regarded. We think that's exaggerated. It's that messages that we or the US offer seldom match the PRC view of the world, and therefore can't be reprocessed through their system into alternative approaches or communication strategies that may work better, including for China itself. So by default, in such a setting, middle powers often find themselves in a state of acute passivity and at the margins, and therefore great powers miss opportunities to gain fresh perspectives. Some attitudes have to shift, including US and Chinese perceptions, with an epiphany or two about the value middle powers can add to the US-China problematique and other issues we must all face ideally together. Too much, a faint hope at best, but a faint step-by-step approach to positioning can alter dangerous trend lines and head off the worst of outcomes. Naturally, middle powers must advance. We're expected to do this, advance and protect our own interests, present and foreseeable, but also to project our values and ideas on making the world or the region a better place. Part of that effort must be tempering where possible and redirecting the current events between the US and the PRC. Stakes are high, again, I've mentioned that, and the costs of failure or neglect are escalating. All available instruments must be deployed and all available tables used in official circles of capitals and among centers of knowledge, opinion, and influence outside government. Track two, if you like. This won't be easy in all fields, whether trade, finance, technology, or security, or on so-called ESG, environmental, social, and governance questions, or on matters of global health and poverty. But for discussion, and there's certainly more, I can see three areas of possible advancement. The basis of a middle power driven or at least brokered agenda. First, we have to find ways to afford policy space for middle powers, issues in which they can help move forward instead of be kept at the margins. Identifying meaningful issues where more players with fewer access to grind can contribute. Climate change and health are often mentioned, but also harder issues like free trade, investment, technology transfer, or infrastructure development or supply chain stability that we hear about so much. Security piece is harder still. There are fewer middle power friendly peacekeeping roles available these days. Not only can middle powers help, but they have legitimate stake in many of these issues areas. Arms control, maritime security, cyber, human trafficking, conflict and resolution and prevention, the models and best practices. That's one, affording policy second. A second is allowing scope for collective approaches, regionally or globally. New arenas may have to be developed to deal with newer issues, or recommitments to existing bodies and their reform and renewal where needed. Middle powers can be especially helpful in these efforts, or making use of regional groupings, which is not always, sometimes not even often the case, and now in Asia Pacific. The mission is to expand capacity for creative and collective solutions, whether in economics or security. Plurilateral experiments like the Quad, for instance, that are underway may help, if not too narrowly based. Again, we must recognize the potential of middle powers to assist, whatever configuration is used. Third, after new fora or renewed old fora, developing leadership and brokerage capabilities within middle powers. We have to relearn the game a little bit. We have to build capacity to influence a world of G2. We have to be sensitive to the reality of rapid evolving circumstances, emerging powers in the world economy, a new diversity of regional and global actors in and out of government, new technologies and business models that affect trade and finance and business practices, and adapted governance needed to provide oversight, transparency, and fairness. Middle powers in the past have been good at this kind of brokerage role, but there is a premium on updating training and communications tools and platforms that are perhaps better keyed than they have been to U.S. and China audiences. In China, and I'm going to wrap up here pretty soon, but with China, we had believed that workable common ground was indeed appearing. We're happy about that. And we thought that China did see us and other middle powers as partners of interest. We hope they still do, in theory, and at least occasionally in practice. We've not lost all hope, but frankly, that confidence has been shaken by recent bilateral experience. Plus, institutions in which middle powers like Canada normally do their best work are weakening. I'm going to mention especially the sad state of WTO. It's a premier example where both China and the US must take seriously. I should mention the Biden administration's new Indo-Pacific strategy. That is actually pretty good at updating agendas and in keeping the US engaged, which I think most middle powers, including Canada, would support. However, it has to be carefully calibrated to avoid exacerbating U.S. China issues rather than easing their resolution. In conclusion, there is policy space for middle powers, or space that can be developed, bringing the U.S. and China back toward a constructive, even if competitive, relationship. This is a vocation for middle powers that we should pursue. Now, we can't be naive. This is easy or fast. Involves greater use of global and regional fora that exists, suitably renewed as necessary. And again, middle powers can be good at reform. Up-to-date agendas on an ever wider range of issues, including non-traditional issues of trade and security. And finally, to say that this is an effort worth making by the U.S., China, and by the middle powers themselves. Thank you. Look forward to your comments.
Well, thank you very much, Ron, for that thoughtful opening remarks. And you have provided a lot of food for thoughts, a lot of ways that middle powers that can work together to perhaps enhance that broker role, and then also adapting to new environment and new challenges, and trying to be creative to create that policy space and capacity and also scope to meaningfully contribute to the international community. Thank you, Ron, for providing the Canadian reading and Canadian perspective on this important topic of the U.S.-China relations. Now I'd like to turn to Professor Deepa Olapalli for your opening thoughts on India's perspective on the U.S.-China relationship.
Thank you so much. Good day, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to be here on this important panel. And thanks, Ron, for providing an overview of middle powers and what the possibilities are there. I would just say a couple of points before I start. One, that the middle power terminology is probably something that New Delhi might resist, because they see itself as a rising power, maybe even a great power. But I think it's always been punching below its weight. And so to that extent, I would agree with a middle power characterization. The second point is that I am not as optimistic about the diplomatic space for middle powers and for joint action, given what is happening on the global scene right now. But let's leave that for discussion. So let me start by looking, I want to make 5 points here today. The first will be to give some context to India's current outlook on U.S.-China relations. And the last 3, I'm going to focus more on what we're learning from the Ukraine situation and its repercussions. I just returned after a research trip to India last week, so the Indian views are quite fresh in my mind. All right, so first of all, India's perspective on the U.S.-China relationship comes from its own increasingly adversarial relations with China. And this goes back to at least 1962, the border war with China, and the fact that China has managed to resolve 13 out of its 14 border disputes, except with India. So this has led to a lot of distrust. And the most recent border clash, which happened in 2020, where lives were lost for the first time in 50 years, is a kind of a turning point. And right now, India-China relations are probably at its worst since 1962. So it's a little hard for me to see a big change here moving forward beyond the ongoing border negotiations that they're involved in to make sure things are not going to get out of hand. So clearly, India's security concerns about China have a deep impact on how New Delhi views trends in relations between Washington and Beijing. And I would say that since about 2008 onwards, India and the US have seen a common threat from a rising China, and this has been the strongest driver for the momentum in their strategic partnership that we now see. So that's sort of the overarching driver for the way in which India views US-China relations. The second point is that India's biggest concern, as it has moved closer and closer to the US, is the potential emergence of something that might look like a G2 that Ron alluded to, which is a kind of a condominium between the US and China. Now, under the first Obama term, this was something that New Delhi worried about a lot, of course, until the Obama administration switched policies and initiated the rebalance to Asia, pivot to Asia in 2011. Overall, India's preference is for a situation in which New Delhi has better ties with Beijing and Washington than they have with each other. Now, this was arguably the case throughout the 1990s into the mid-2000s, which was the best case scenario for India, since it felt it had greater leverage this way. The more recent conscious self-declared US shift from the engagement with China to the more open competitive relationship that Ron has talked about, that really began most strongly under Trump and continuing under Biden, is for India, it's seen as somewhat reassuring. The underlying idea of the new security strategy, the emphasis on the Indo-Pacific itself, was a recognition by the US of India's growing importance and the need to have a more strategic link between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And since the main site of US-China competition is Indo-Pacific, this fits in very well with India's own threat perceptions of the Indo-Pacific, especially in the Indian Ocean. So the latest Indo-Pacific strategy that was released in February, rather hastily, I should say, by the Biden administration, is something that is welcomed by India. The attention to the Quad by the Biden team right from the start is also welcomed. Now, that said, India does not take the US commitment in the Indo-Pacific for granted, nor does it feel it can fully count on American support for Indian security concerns. And the examples and evidence for this, we can point to the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which is a huge nightmare for India, security nightmare. And now, of course, Ukraine conflict, which seems to be drawing America back to its transatlantic NATO focus, which has been historically the case. So while India welcomes US forcefulness in the Indo-Pacific, it doesn't want it to be the basis for an alliance type agreement. India's priorities go beyond just a military agenda to economics and infrastructure and connectivity that is just something shared by all the middle powers that are represented here today. And most importantly, India does not want the US or the Quad led by the US to be an overly provocative instrument of coercion against China in the Indo-Pacific. India wants to raise costs for China, but given that it has a live border conflict and a big military gap, it doesn't want itself to invite conflict. So against that background, my next 3 points are on the evolving situation in Ukraine. And so the third point I want to make is that we need to make a distinction between the way the US sees China and Russia and the way India sees China and Russia. The US tendency to group China and Russia as an authoritarian power axis threatening the global order is not something India subscribes to. Russia has been a longstanding diplomatic supporter and military supplier, which India sees great value in. In other words, India sees Russia as a friend, China as a competitor, or even hostile, whereas the US is now hostile to both Russia and China. So we have a different kind of configuration here. This contradiction between India and the US has been played out in the UN, for example, on the UN votes and the attitude on sanctions on Russia. And here, the India abstained on suspending Russia from the UN Human Rights Council, calling into question the whole process by which the resolution was initiated. So there is quite a certain dissonance between US and India on this. And in fact, the China and India have been more on the same page on Russia here. But that has not necessarily led to a closer relationship between China and India. Now, in the context, this is my fourth point, is in the context of worsening relations between US and China over Ukraine, how is India interpreting it? Well, I think it's a wait and watch approach, but I don't see much optimism about the outcome. Overall, New Delhi is worried that American reaction to the invasion will have the effect of strengthening Beijing, if not emboldening it. There's little confidence in the old idea that somehow a dip in U.S. China relations will benefit India this time around. At the very beginning of the war, many Indian analysts were rushing to the conclusion that the country that would benefit the greatest from the Ukraine conflict was China. Politically, it would gain a much weakened and highly dependent Russia as a junior partner with no leverage. And in turn, India stood to lose a strong, historic, and reliable partner. Economically, thanks to the unprecedented sanctions on Russia, which many countries in the global south and middle powers are getting negatively affected by, there's a growing perception that a process of de-dollarization is being set into motion, again, to China's benefit. In other words, the Ukraine conflict could well deliver to China some key benefits that it could not have secured by itself. And this is the dominant view that is in New Delhi right now. My final point and my conclusion is that India is exercising a surprising level of its historic preference for what can be called strategic autonomy on the question of Russia and Ukraine, even as it is clearly a strategic partner of the US and the liberal Western powers. This has led to some testy public exchanges at the highest level between Foreign Minister of India and the Secretary of State of the United States. Now, there's some indication that China sees this as a possible opening for China-India relations to improve. In fact, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, very early in the Ukraine conflict, reached out to New Delhi to resolve their differences and to preserve the BRICS meeting that China is supposed to host next. Wang Yi also made a visit to India to try to kickstart their dialogue. And this is not surprising. Over the past decade, China has been worried about the growing US-India strategic embrace and would like to weaken that if possible. So in this case, a loosening of US-India ties holds some potential for China to make gains. However, I really don't see any breakthroughs between India and China happening, and I don't see any big dips in US-India relations despite India's foreign policy independence regarding Ukraine. The main reason I say this is the growing common threat perception about China by both the US and India, specifically in the Indo-Pacific. And I think New Delhi expects this will continue no matter what happens with Ukraine and Russia, although there will be some adjustments. And I will end by saying that I still see some residual concern in India about the lingering possibility of US improving relations with China and making some kind of deal if American resources and attention gets more and more diverted into the European theater and the US begins to feel overstretched in Asia. So you cannot rule that out, and India is not ruling that out. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Deepa, for that fascinating summary and a highlight of India's perspective of this, the G2, and especially this concept of the strategic autonomy, and India is really trying to find its strike a balance between U.S. and China, and maybe maintaining some sort of productive relationship with both, yet setting its eyes on its preserving, of course, India's strategic interest in the region and also globally. It's a really fascinating summary of Indian stance, and that's very much appreciated. Now, across the Pacific, I'd like to invite Professor Rumi Ayama for your perspective on the Japanese view of this important U.S.-China relationship. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me to this important event, and it is my pleasure to be on the panel. Today, I'll be talking about Japan's position in the rivalry of between China and the United States. I would say that Japan has a is a very unique case, and actually Japan has strategic leverage amid this rivalry. So if we look at Japan and the United States, the United States and Japan actually are now in the best relationship since the end of the Cold War. And the two countries are now working closely together in bilateral or multilateral framework aimed at sort of creating a free and open Indo-Pacific region. But on the other hand, in terms of Sino-Japanese relations, the bilateral relations can be described as both stable and fragile. So despite the ups and downs of their political relations, the economic relations between the two countries have always been very dynamic. So this may suggest that the Japanese foreign policy has been generally successful in handling the delicate balance between the United States and China. So some actually may argue that Japan's reluctance to adopt an overly assertive approach toward China has contributed to the relatively stable economic relationship. So in this sense, U.S. President Biden's containment policy toward China places Japan in a very difficult position. But the reality, is that if we look at the involvement right now, so the closer analysis actually shows that Japan's China policy is no weaker than Australia's on issues such as the South China Sea, human rights, and policies on Taiwan. And in fact, since 2010, Japan has consistently challenged China's core interests by holding military exercises in the South China Sea or taking the lead in issuing international statements condemning China's Hong Kong policies. And the ruling parties of Japan and Taiwan has held 2+2 dialogues. So if this is the case, if Japan is not accommodating China's national interests, then this could raise two important questions. So first, why actually haven't relations between Japan and China deteriorated as much as they have been between China and Australia? And the second question would be, why is the Japan-China relations a stable but fragile one? So in my view, this is because Japan has strategic leverage in the U.S.-China competition, and two factors may have contributed to this. One is the asymmetry of threat perception, and the other is Japan's importance in China's strategic calculations. So first of all, I'll explain the asymmetry of threat perception. So for Japan, China is now its biggest security concern. So Japan's concern over China's military expansion has increased sharply in recent years, especially since the 2010 collision. And the second crisis actually occurred in September 2012, when Japan nationalized some of the Senkaku Islands. So as far as Japan is concerned, China's action in 2010 and 2012 represent a coordinated move from the top to challenge and change the status quo in the disputed islands. And also in some other move moves on the China side, such as, well, the ADIS in the East China Sea. Also, this has further sounded the alarm about China's assertive intentions toward Japan. So this kind of security concerns is shared by both the government and the academic community. So of course, there's no shortage of voices in Japan that oppose the enhancement of Japan's military capability through legal reforms. But however, in the face of like the rising concerns over the disputed waters, so this kind of voices seem increasingly unrealistic and out of step in the mainstream. But so if we look at China, I know more and more in recent years, China has been expressing its concerns about Japan's growing military might, but especially after like Japan's nationalization of Senkaku Island in 2012. So China's security concerns over Japan's increasing military power has intensified. However, well, China's main security concern is about it's about the U.S. or sort of U.S. is trying to build a NATO, Asian version of NATO in Asia, and China feels like it is encircled by the NATO's eastern expansion and the U.S. security network. So in this sense, Japan, the security concern represented by Japan arises mainly from its security relations with the United States. So that is why the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman publicly criticized Japan for willingly being directed by the United States and acting as a strategic vassal of the United States. So in short, this asymmetric threat perception has led Japan to adopt a hardline foreign policy toward China, and also has led China to adopt a low-profile approach in trying and avoid open confrontation with Japan. And also, Japan is very important to China's in China's strategic calculation, because China has launched its BRI from in 2013, and shortly after the announcement of BRI, China has this 2-day foreign affairs meetings that emphasized the importance of improving relations with its neighboring countries. So Japan, as important China's neighboring countries, has become an essential partner in promoting the BRI. And also amid the rising tensions with the United States, the strategic importance of the Asia-Pacific region to China's foreign policy has further increased. And so that is why China is making every effort to improve its political and economic ties with other countries in the Asia-Pacific. And also there is a wide divergence of opinions within China concerning relations with Japan. But I think Beijing is focusing primarily on making sure its relations with Tokyo don't deteriorate it. So I would say that Japan has strategic leverage in the U.S. and China rivalry, and Japan is actually shaping the course, strategic course or geopolitical course in the Asia-Pacific region. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rumi, for that summary of Japan's stance on or Japan's views of the Canada of the U.S.-China relations, and it's clearly strategic positioning in the neighborhood of China, and it's important consideration for China. And I think probably the economic dimension is also very important realm of focus, as China is really increasingly turned to look at its neighbors to strengthen those economic ties. So that might also be part of that calculus in keeping this important relationship sound and not get into direct conflicts with Japan, despite, as you suggested, Professor Ayoma, that Japan has taken a harder or harsh line in terms of foreign policy and some of the similar policies as Australia, but Japan hasn't faced as much of China's might in those fronts. So fascinating thoughts from you on Japan. Now I would like to turn over to Captain Yoon on your views of South Korea's perspective in managing this very tricky U.S.-China relationship. Over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you, Ja, introducing me. And it is my great honor to be part of these unique occasions. Having considering the topics given by organization, I would like to raise two questions in order to answer the topics. The first, can South Korea sustain its middle power status during intensifying U.S.-China strategic competition? Some theoretical analysis discuss the concept of middle power, which in East Asia would include the South Korea, Japan, Australia, and ASEAN. This status is not recognized by the United States or China, but in practice, they both compete for the support these middle powers at the expenses of U.S.-China strategic competition. South Korea is established as a responsible and effective middle power, which is sustainable economic, military, and diplomatic clout, not to mention social network capabilities, which is we can observe in Russia-Ukraine war in Europe. Unlike other nations, South Korea has tried to pursue its national interest of a strategic autonomy, for which a credible defense posture against North Korea's threat is fundamental. The concept of middle power status is sometimes understood as a way to avoid the involvement in U.S.-China strategic competition. But South Korea's stance is more accurately characterized as comprehensive autonomy between two great powers. South Korea has been more successful than other regional middle powers in carefully balancing between United States and China, shifting its position as event required to maintain its national interest first. The most recent challenge to balance is the U.S.-led Indo-Pacific strategy, which is widely perceived as directed against China. The current South Korean President Moon Jae-in has committed South Korea to some involvement in this policy, such as South China Sea and Taiwan Strait crisis, even as yet vaguely defined. And in the long term, it is still plausible for South Korea to survive as a reasonably comprehensive autonomous middle power. Then I would like to move to second questions to answer the topics given by organization. Because we are supposed to be new government in the next month. So my question is, what should the new South Korean administration consider in formulating its middle power status for self-defined national security and defense strategies? South Korea will face some formidable challenges. United States decline as a world power is practically obvious in East Asia, where it may become difficult to maintain a kind of liberal and democratic good order now enjoyed by South Koreans. China continued to build its economic and military power and clearly intended to re-establish the regional dominance it lost in the 19th centuries, with something like a Chinese version of Monroe Doctrine. If the US weakens or loses its strategic influence or interest, then China will make the South China Sea and the East China Sea into Chinese possessions. And it is South Koreans who concern. The seas around the Korea Peninsula will be next. China also maintains North Korea as a bumper against South Korea and United States influence. And since North Korea economy is dependent on China, the Kim Jong-un regime is a useful tool for China to threaten the South Korea and United States as well as Japan. Then South Korea's middle power status can articulate some comprehensive autonomous policies, which the new South Korean administration will likely adopt without alternation, as a South Korean middle power policy toward United States and China is more contentious. South Korea has constantly attempted to promote peace, for example, through the exercising its middle power status to reduce military tensions and also mitigate the expansion of U.S. Republic of Korea alliance, which will be counterproduce of negative impact from China. The resuming of North Korea's missile tests are seen by the many as demonstrating the failure of South Korea's middle power role of mitigating military tensions of the Korea Peninsula. It is well known that incoming South Korean government may try to repair South Korea-Japan relations, which is badly hurt during a couple of years due to historical legacies. And U.S.-South Korea alliance, which is something weird weakened by the current Moon Jae-in government, because Moon Jae-in government emphasis more its weight on the Korean national interest first, rather than to more respect to U.S. strategic intentions and then some interest. However, this may only be resurfaced if South Korea population won middle power policies to put South Korean interests first by responding to events through the balanced, flexible diplomacy in order to reduce the threat from North Korea without engaging a serious conflict. This would be easier if South Korea can exercise its middle power role of U.S. China, which are lost self-confidence simultaneously in recent couple of years. It is a little bit concerning that incoming South Korean government will be led by the President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol wants to draw the line under the Moon's era by reinforcing United States-South Korea alliance. This may entail making South Korea scapegoat of losing South Korea's middle power status by its participation in U.S.-led Indo-Pacific strategy and applying its capabilities to beyond the Korea Peninsula, which means South Korea will be actively proactive actors for engaging U.S.-led Indo-Pacific strategy, and then lose the nuance for the South Korea-China strategic partnership relations. So South Korea's role in middle power status is different from Quad or AUKUS, which is established last year. Instead, South Korea may get some involvement with associated non-military issues, such as supply chain mechanism, artificial intelligence adaptation for the military purpose, supplementary semiconductor provision, space and cyber domain security, and public health improvement. These would be factors what middle power role in sustaining regional peace and stability. So my conclusion is simple. South Korea's comprehensive autonomy as a middle power status is inevitably affected by the rivalry between United States and China. South Korea's new government foreign policy and military strategy will certainly involving reshaping United States and South Korea alliance. But whatever the South Korea want to be middle power, incoming government will have to respond flexibly to a constantly changing security environment imbalancing between United States and China. As the world observes Russia-Ukraine war in Europe, where United States and China set up their position of a sideline, not the active involvement to mitigating military conflict in the Ukraine. I'd better stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain Yoon, for that opening thoughts. It's clearly South Korea is also faced with this dilemma to try to balance between U.S. and China, and the new, as you suggested, the new government is likely to have a closer alignment with the U.S. and its allies, including on security issues in the region, and that may be risking its traditional, or at least the current more nuanced approach that the current government has been implementing to balance this tricky relationship. So we're all, of course, watching closely what the policies from the new government will bring in, and it's probably going to be an interesting follow-up when that transition happens. Thank you very much. Now I would like to turn to Sarab for your take on Australia's perspective, managing this strategic rivalry, strategic competition between US and China, and where Australia stands. Over to you.
Thank you, Jia. I am among the panelists, the only non-national of that nation. And therefore, let me try to do justice to Australian policy by looking at it through an Australian lens in my presentation. Obviously, the bottom has fallen out in terms of Australia-China relations. They have deteriorated in ways unforeseeable, and it's not going to be repaired very easily. There's an irony here because usually the relations, the countries with which China has difficult relations with in its neighborhood are typically those with which it has an outstanding open land or maritime boundary dispute or a sovereign rights related dispute. And that's not the case with Australia. And yet the relationship is really, frankly, in a terrible state. There's an important election coming up in Australia in a month's time. And we'll have to see whether the incumbent government, which took a fairly strong line on China, still retains office or not. It's fairly tight. We'll have to see. In Australia-China relations, the Australians, yes, they don't have that much leverage in that direct bilateral relationship, but we shouldn't forget that China does want to accede to the CPTPP. This is the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's part of trying to deepen its reform and opening up agenda domestically. And Australia has an important veto power by being a member of CPTPP. So there is a certain degree of leverage out here. But anyway, the point the purpose of my presentation today is to take a kind of a more broader look at Australian foreign defense and strategic policy planning and thinking with regard to China and with regard to the region. And that itself will give a fair idea of where it stands with China and look at it over a long historical arc. And thereafter just touch on two other smaller issues, smaller topics. One would be AUKUS and the other would be the Australia-Japan relationship. Australia's enduring strategic dilemma has been reconciling its Anglo-Saxon origins with its non-Anglo-Saxon geography. It is an Asian country in the Asian neighborhood and an Anglo-Saxon country. And so the question has forever been, should the region be regarded as an opportunity and a region to be engaged, or is it potentially a hostile environment from which might threaten the security of Australia? And a derivative of this enduring theme has been to guard against the rise of any potentially powerful and hostile forces among the emerging great powers, power in Asia. And I would submit that sort of thinking is once again coming to the fore. And let me explain that in context of Australia's long national historical arc in terms of defense policy planning. You know, in the early Cold War days, this was when the Prime Minister was Prime Minister Menzies. At that point of time, you know, President Dwight Eisenhower talked about the domino theory in Asia, and Australia had constructed its security planning within what was termed forward defense. It would take an active role in preemption of communism and serve primarily as the southern anchor of the Western Bloc. And Australia was all in this strategy with the United States. I need to just back up a little bit and say that, you know, Australia in the first half of the 20th century was tied very closely to Britain, but after Singapore fell in 1942, it switched that allegiance to the Americans, and the Americans filled that role. Okay. We talked about Whitlam. Fast forward to the 1970s, President Nixon had talked about his Guam doctrine, in which the region must start to take a little more responsibility for its own security. And at that time, Prime Minister Whitlam had talked about downplaying the centrality of forward defense not denigrating the alliance relationship. The alliance relationship was important, but also placing greater engagement on regional engagement. And Australia's regional engagement, I would submit, actually can be traced back to that date from about the 1970s onwards. Fast forward once again, this is 1987 Defense White Paper. You know, in 1986, Mikhail Gorbachev had made a very important statement in Vladivostok, where he was essentially drawing the curtain down on the Cold War in the Pacific, in the Asia Pacific. And this was hence a new strategic environment. And the Australian Defense White Paper's focus, therefore, was on greater security self-reliance that was not US dependent. The alliance was of course important, but Australia must have the capacity to defend itself of its own means through sophisticated weapon systems, platforms, etc., etc. So we see, and Australia began to take a more greater involvement in a larger, greater global role beyond just its regional horizons. Now let's fast forward to Prime Minister Morrison and the 2020 Defense Strategy and Force Structure Review. And that essentially is once again a reversion to forward defense, the policies in the early years of the Cold War. It's not a full reversion, but the main thrust of it is that Australia needs to downplay a little bit about its global ambitions and have a much more tighter regional concentrated focus. It needs to tighten its alliance related requirements and see how it can work with more tightly within the alliance, and a kind of a watered down goal of defense self-reliance. You know, as late as the 2013 Defense White Paper during Prime Minister Julia Gillard's time, it was specifically mentioned that Australia does not approach China as an adversary and does not have to choose between China and the United States. And Prime Minister Gillard was from the Labour Party. Her predecessor from the Liberal Party. This is John Howard, which is the same party as Prime Minister Morrison. It's the Conservative Party. Even at his time, he was saying in the mid 2000s. Australia doesn't have to choose. Australia can try to focus its attention on trying to show these two great powers, China and the United States, why there's such a great interest of them working together and productively for the region. China doesn't have to choose between its economic partner, which is China, and its security partner, the United States. But come 2020, I mean, especially after the Trump administration and the Trump national security strategy saying that we are back in an era of great power competition, and with Australia-China relations really deteriorating terribly in the last couple of years, it is back again to a reversion of what I would say the forward defense policy in terms of Australian strategic thinking. And I wouldn't say it's coming full circle, but we are getting there. And that's why we need to see if there is a Labour government coming in, whether that will slow down the process, because Labour takes a slightly more balanced perspective in terms of the relationship with China, while the Conservatives are more alliance first. So again, Australia has gone from not having to choose to, yes, we are choosing, and rather we have chosen. Let me get to AUKUS thereafter. Obviously, Australia ties are very robust, very institutionalized. The joint facilities, there's a lot of activity happening, but obviously AUKUS has become this red shiny object in the Asia Pacific region of tremendous, immense utility and implications. And the main logic of this was so that Australian submarines, which typically have very long transit times. Australia is in the region, but it's not close by. It's a huge distance. And now the only constraint on Australia's underwater activity in the Asia Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific, would be the endurance of the submarine crew, and it can be out there. And what is the primary logic in terms of AUKUS? The primary logic is it's China versus US and Australia. China wants to have the South China Sea as a bastion for its second strike capability, as well as for its submarines that the West, Australia and the US cannot bring their submarines into that bastion. And China has an interest in also breaking through that first island chain perimeter. And contrarily, the Western incentive is to try to break into that bastion, into the South China Sea, come close to China's submarine bases, and at minimum lock China up within the first island chain perimeter. And what this just means that the implications for the South China Sea is that it's going to become an even more crowded strategic environment. AUKUS is moving forward aggressively. I think just within the past couple of months, there's been an exchange of naval nuclear propulsion information agreement. They've also decided that the base is going to be on the east coast of Australia. Australia already has a submarine base for its conventionally powered submarines, but on the west coast, but this is going to be on the east coast, and the submarine shipyard is going to be somewhere in South Australia. So AUKUS is moving forward and moving forward rapidly. And it's also very recently, I think it was just this month itself, the AUKUS leaders, it's trilateral, so the UK is also involved, talked about moving just beyond submarines, into autonomous underwater vehicles and into hypersonic and counter-hypersonic capabilities. So, I mean, lots happening on that front, and this is really the tip of the spear in terms of alliance-related activity. Finally, I thought I'd touch on the Australia-Japan dynamic, simply because there have been tremendous important developments which have gone somewhat under the radar, but should be mentioned. Again, this is a very well institutionalized security relationship. They've had intelligence cooperation since the 1970s, bilateral pole mill and mill talks since the mid-1990s. There's a joint declaration on security cooperation, action plan to implement it, an AXA for logistics supply, an information security agreement for sensitive information to be passed on, defense equipment and technology agreement. And all these happened across both liberal and conservative governments, as well as across LDP and DPJ governments also. But I would submit the most important one is the one which was just signed earlier this year. It's called the Reciprocal Access Facilitation Agreement. In itself, there's nothing earth-shattering about it. It's about providing facilities for troops of either countries. But the important point I would mention out here is that as a reciprocal bargain, what the Japanese did was to trigger the application of Article 95(2) of its self-defense law, which is essentially as per its revised new defense security policy reinterpretation of its Article 9. What this does is that it allows the Japanese to provide asset protection as in military asset protection for Australian vessels and Australian troops, etc. And if they are, of course, at the time of when they're doing joint exercises and training. But what I would also submit, the most important part out here is that by triggering 95(2), it also allows Japan to provide transportation, logistics, and replenishment supply to the Australians in an event of what Japan calls an important influence situation in its neighborhood to Japan's security. As part of its reinterpretation of its Article 9, it made various gradations in terms of what Japan could do in terms of loosening its prohibitions. The top one is an armed attack or a survival threatening situation, but just beneath that is what is called an important influence situation to Japanese security. And in that case, Japan will be able to provide transportation, logistics, replenishment to Australian forces. And the main point here being, if we do have a South China Sea contingency, we will see perhaps the US and Australia involved, but that will also tie the Japanese into a situation. And this, of course, in a Taiwan Strait situation, Japan might trigger its survival threatening situation capabilities, the ability to assist in a survival threatening operation. But otherwise, I would submit that through the reciprocal access facilitation agreement and the bargain which has been made, Japan will effectively be a combatant in a situation related to the South China Sea or even the Taiwan Straits, even if it is not directly involved in the conflict, but it will be supporting its Western partners, and therefore it's tied more closely. And Australia-Japan security ties, therefore, have become considerably more tightened in terms of a military situation. Let me stop at that point of time. I just wanted to give that larger overview of Australia, where it has been in terms of its historical arc and where it is coming back. And I think it's coming back full circle, particularly, and we can see the China element factored into that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Saurabh, for that historical examination of the evolution of Australia's strategic and the security policies, especially as regards to the region. Okay, so we don't have a lot of time, so I'm just hoping to quickly turn to a few questions, and some questions are addressed to individual panelists. So I'll just hopefully we will quickly go through them. I think this one would be for Ron. The question is, how would you examine the history and development of Canada's trade relationship with the US and China? Of course, US being Canada's #1 trading partner and China being #2, a distant #2. What are some of the proper strategies that Canada has employed to maintain the balance of this power struggle? Ron, perhaps if we can go with a bit of a rapid fire type of answers, that would be great.
Well, I think that drawing from personal experience, a lot of it has to do with effective advocacy in capitals, in Beijing, and in my case, in the case of Washington. You have to be optimistic that there are always allies for Canada's points of view on certain issues. In my case, 20 years ago, it was environmental issues and fisheries issues. There are always communities of interest in the United States that do favor more multilateral approaches, and you have to work with those people because that is in our interests. In China, I haven't served in mainland China. I've visited many times, but I believe that there are communities of interest and expertise in China that favor the reopening, or perhaps the resumed opening of the Chinese economy, and a more peaceful and more cooperative approach on political and security questions. You have to find those places, and you have to work with communities of interest to advance, first of all, Canada's own interests in these places, but also to create the conditions that more people will see the mutual advantage in working together on, as I said, new policy spaces or new institutions to advance those policies.
Well, thank you, Ron. Now I would like to turn to Rumi. Here's a question for you. So do you believe the vocal anti-base movement in Okinawa suggests growing public opposition to closer Japan-US security ties? Or do you think it's just limited to the locals? And do you think it's actually some sentiment that's nationwide, or it's just more the locals that are opposing these stronger security ties?
Okay, thank you so much for the questions. I would say that this is just an Okinawa specific issue, because Okinawans have a feeling that they are bearing all the burden of the US-Japan security alliance. And the Japanese people in general are increasingly concerned about China's growing military power and China's maritime assertiveness. So that is why there's growing support for an increase in the military budget, and then understanding that strengthening the Japan-US alliance is vital to Japan's defense. Yes,
Right, thank you for that answer. And now here's a question for Captain Yun. In observing the shift in the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy and its maritime security strategies to better compete with China, what is the impact of the strategy shift to South Korea? What role will South Korea play as a middle power in this big G2 strategic competition when both countries are increasingly moving beyond the East Asia periphery and moving further into the West Pacific?
Well, the answer is very simple. South Korea got to be reduced military tension with North Korea in terms of maintaining strong and ironclad United States South Korea alliance, which have been lasting more than 7 decades since Korean War. But now we have another problem, which is, as you mentioned, very tricky, very risky situation for South Korean security environment, which means U.S. China strategic competition. Many South Korean policymakers, especially in the President Moon's administration, want to contain Indo-Pacific strategy only in South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan Strait crisis. We don't want to move that strategy to Korea Peninsula because we have an alliance with United States. So for the next government, they are more favor of recalibrate U.S. South Korea military alliance in order to contain China's threat, because many policymakers in Washington, D.C. May not be happy with President Moon's policy toward China and North Korea, which is President Moon's emphasis. It appears to be Korea central interest first policy. But from the U.S. perspective, that is kind of something anti-American policy, which is not benefit for the United States' strategic interest in Northeast Asia. So now United States asks South Korea new government provide more contribution, more for the Indo-Pacific strategy in order to contain China, as well as to mitigate military tensions of the Korea Peninsula. In my personal view, it's not quite workable strategy for the Korea Peninsula. So as I mentioned in the opening remarks, I'm a little bit concerned about the new government policy toward the United States. And there may be some undermining our relationship with China. but we got to be balanced between United States and China. I don't know what the next government will maintain is foreign and defense policy toward the United States and China in the more balancing and more flexible manners. But if Indo-Pacific strategy leads us to out of the Korea Peninsula, we have a big problem on that. So simple question is, our first priority of our national security is threat from North Korea, not the threat from China. So reshaping U.S. South Korea alliance is okay. Whatever new government formulates the new policy towards United States, we should consider the future role of China to the peace and stability of Korea Peninsula. I think it would not be easy task, but it's still plausible task for new government. That would be my answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain Yun. Maybe a final question to Deepa.
Yes.
Sorry, maybe a final question would be to Professor Olipali. So how do you perceive India's rise of power? And to what extent do you believe that it would reshape the power competition between US and China? And if so, how? Perhaps just quick answer if possible.
Yes, this is a very good question. I think that India and the US right now, as I said, have a strong convergence on the Indo-Pacific. They both want to avoid a situation where the Indo-Pacific becomes China-centric, meaning where China has a veto power. And I think that India does stand as one of the biggest sort of deterrers for China to play a more expansionist role in the Indo-Pacific. It has a great vulnerability in the Malacca Straits and in the Indian Ocean, where India has a certain huge advantage. But I think what is complicating in terms of reshaping the environment there is that India, again, does not want a situation where you lead with conflict or with a provocation. So India, unlike perhaps the United States and Australia and Japan, India has a harder time because it's not part of the alliance. And it will never become part of the US alliance just because of its own history. So it wants to play an independent role. And I think it will probably, at least what I'm seeing now from the fallout of the Ukraine, is that it's going to go more into defense modernization, indigenous production, and have increased ability to play a bigger role by itself. But I think it will rely on the United States to keep China bottled up perhaps on the Pacific side and keep it that way.
Thank you, Professor Olipali. As we're getting short on time, I would just like to thank all our speakers today for your fascinating presentation, your remarks, and also for your engagement with our audience members on their questions. And now I have one more task to do. It's just with great pleasure, I would like to invite Mr. Ren Libo, who is the founder and CEO of Grandview Institution. I would like to invite him to provide some concluding remarks. Mr. Ren is has been with the Grandview Institution thing since inception. almost 10 years ago, and he had previously led multiple divisions in Xinhua News Agency and penned numerous policy reports on major political and economic issues for top Chinese policymakers at the CPC Central Committee and also the State Council. Over to you, Mr. Yuan, for your concluding remarks.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, Dr. Hong Nong, distinguished speakers. I'm Ren Libo, founder of Grandview Institution. It's my great honor to be here and listen to your insightful sharing. Tonight's topics are really essential and important at this point of time. I have gained many insights and ideas from your views and opinions, and I would like to take this opportunity to share my thoughts. Since the normalization of Sino-US relations 4 decades ago, there have been largely cooperation and some extent of competition between China and the US. Currently, the Sino-US relations is facing great adversity, part of which is due to divergent development philosophies and political systems, whereas strategic misunderstanding and confrontations also played a significant role. Communication has also been blockaded to the COVID-19 situation. Despite all the downturns, we are seeing many experts and rationalists are still confident towards healthy Sino-US relations that contribute to constructive stability and looking forward to a healthy competition and risk management mechanism. Grandview Institution is also a faithful upholder of rationalism. We hold the view that rationalism, cooperation, communication, as well as fair and logical risk management mechanism is the key to the healthy relationship. In the future, the role of middle countries in the development of Sino-US relations will be significantly enhanced. Just as middle countries helped China to grow rapidly and contributed to the overall development of Sino-US relations in the context of the establishment of the diplomatic relations between China and the US. Over the past few decades, China has not forgotten the important support for China's economic takeoff by a larger number of low interest loans and free aid from Japan. The key leadership of South Korea in the field of precision manufacturing to the rise of China's manufacturing industry, and the development of Canada in China's higher education field. For a telling example, in the future, the attitude of middle countries towards China and their interpretation of the development of Sino-US relations in the global development will also greatly affect the development directions of Sino-US relations. The unrest international order needs rationalism, which could promote stability and lead to constructive progress. Think tanks as a means for conveying rationalism shall play a more important role in terms of healthy competition and the risk management mechanism between China and the US in the future. We should also pay more attention to middle powers' role and ability to contribute to a stable and development-oriented international order. All these issues of concern have been in Grandview Institution's research plan and communication agenda. We really look forward to learning more from the American and the Western think tanks so that we may use our independent research outcomes to make scientific and practical suggestions. For example, while China and the United States to compete in some areas, they could start to cooperate in many other matters, such as climate change, pandemic situations, as well as food crisis. Together with middle powers, we may collectively mitigate the current regional and unbalanced development. As an independent think tank, Grandview Institution has been a research-oriented think tank with independent funding, independent agenda setting, and independent talent recruitment for 9 years. In addition to research, we also conduct extensive exchanges with foreign think tanks and institutions in various forms. From 2020 to 2021, we have maintained an exchange frequency online dialogues with foreign think tanks almost every 10 days. I am particularly grateful to Director Hong Nong for introducing Grandview Institution to this meaningful dialogue. And I especially look forward to Grandview Institution continuing such a dialogue in the future to serve the in-depth exchanges between experts and think tanks of various countries. Finally, I would like to say thank you to the Center of Sino-American Studies and the Institute of China Studies at the University of Alberta for their extraordinary and meaningful organization work. Once again, I would like to thank the experts again for their great views, and I hope we can see you again soon. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Li Bo, for your remark, which highlights the role of think tanks in understanding the bilateral and multilateral relation. I think that's where we get the Three Institute to organize this event. And thanks to Jia for being such a great moderator. And I think on behalf of the three institutions, I would like to express our sincere appreciation to our five excellent speakers for your insightful discussion. And we were going to release an executive summary based on today's discussion and then share with you later. And also thanks to our participants online, particularly for those from Asia who stayed very late for the whole discussion. And we look forward to seeing you in our next program. Thank you very much.